We've been talking about the arguments for God's existence, which in another way you can say that is to say that we've been talking about natural theology. Natural theology is the branch of theology that talks about what sort of justification we can provide for the existence of God apart from the Bible. And so we don't have to, in this section, look necessarily at the Bible for these proofs of these premises. We can look directly at nature, use our general intuitions that most of us have, and so we can look at scientific evidence and all that kind of thing. And so anything that is not used in the Bible, we can use for this section in defending these premises. And so let's now turn to the Kalam Cosmological argument. And if everyone should have an outline. So the Kalam is spelled K-A-L-A-M. And we're going to be working through this. I'll give just a little bit of a background on why it's called the Kalam Cosmological argument. But so it's an argument from the beginning of the universe. And so last time we talked about, where we wrapped up our discussion of the Leibnizian cosmological argument. And that argument was from the existence of anything at all. Why does something exist rather than nothing? And so that question is obviously different than this question. This question is, why did the universe begin to exist? Did the universe begin to exist in the first place? And so, and have you ever wondered that yourself? Have you ever wondered if the universe began? And if you think about it, like, how can the universe just completely stretch back and back and back in time? You know, it's a question that I think we all have at one time or another. And so you might be surprised to learn that for centuries, men have grappled with this question, with the idea of an infinite past, whether the universe had a beginning. And so there's these ancient Greek philosophers, one of them named Aristotle. He believed that matter was necessary and uncreated and therefore eternal in the past. God may be responsible for introducing some sort of order in the universe, Aristotle thought. He introduced order, but the actual matter itself, the universe, he didn't create it. It was just eternal alongside God. And so this Greek view was in contrast to the ancient Jewish view on the subject. Hebrew writers held that the universe had not always existed, but that it had a beginning. And so as the first verse in the Hebrew Bible, our Bible states, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, in Genesis 1:1. And so eventually these two traditions, the Greek and the Jewish traditions, began to interact with each other. And so there arose a debate within philosophy, and an ongoing debate that lasted for well over 1,000 years about whether or not the universe had a beginning. And so this debate played itself out among Jews and Muslims and as well as Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. And so it finally sputtered to something of an inconclusive end in the thought of the great 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And this is another big name in philosophy, Immanuel Kant. Kant held that, ironically, that there are rationally compelling arguments for both statements. So for the statement that the universe is eternal and also for the statement that the universe began to exist. He held that there's both of those positions are rational to hold, and therefore it defeats, it sort of shows the bankruptcy of reason itself. That's what Kant believed. And so Dr. Craig, the guy who teaches this class and provides the content for this class, and whom some of you were able to see speak in person yesterday, he was the last speaker yesterday. He wrote his doctoral thesis on this argument, his dissertation, on the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. And so he was able to explore the historical roots of this argument, as well as deepen the analysis of it. He also discovered some amazing connections with contemporary astronomy and astrophysics. And so he was able to see that science itself supports the notion that the universe began to exist. And he was able to do this in his doctoral work on it. And so because of its roots in medieval Islamic theology, Craig dubbed this argument the Kalam cosmological argument to differentiate it from the other cosmological arguments. And again, the one that we looked at last time was that anything exists at all, right? Why does something exist rather than nothing? But that's different from this argument, which is an argument from the beginning of the universe. And so he dubbed it the Kalam to sort of differentiate it. And the Kalam is the Arabic word for medieval theology. It's almost like we say the Bible is the Word. They say Kalam for the word of the Quran, if you want to put it that way. And so it was actually medieval Islamic theology that developed this argument first, to a great degree of sophistication. And so Craig wanted to sort of give them the recognition that they deserve. So this argument, the Kalam Cosmological argument, has sort of largely been forgotten since the time of Kant. But it is now back at the center stage of discussion today. It was sort of forgotten about when Kant came around, and now it's back at the center stage of philosophical discussion. The Cambridge Companion to Atheism, which was published in 2007, reports this. Account of the articles in the philosophy journals shows that more articles have been published about the Kalam argument that have been published about any other contemporary formulation of an argument for God's existence. Theists and atheists alike cannot leave the Kalam argument alone. And so what is this argument, though, that has so stirred such interest? And so let's let one of its greatest medieval Muslim proponents of it speak for himself. So Al-Ghazali was a 12th century theologian from Persia, or modern-day Iran now. So he was concerned that Muslim philosophers of his day were being influenced by the ancient Greek philosophers to deny God's creation of the universe. Remember that they held that the universe, or matter itself, was co-eternal with God. It's always been around. And so he was saying that he was concerned that they were being influenced, he was concerned that the Muslim philosophers were being influenced by these other Greek views and ideas. And so after thoroughly studying the works and teachings of these philosophers, Al-Ghazali, again, the guy that sort of formulated this argument to sophistication, he wrote a withering critique of their views in the book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And so in this book, Ghazali argues that the idea of a beginningless universe is absurd. He argues that the universe must have a beginning, and since nothing can begin to exist without a cause, there must be a transcendent creator of the universe. Okay, this is what Al-Ghazali argued in this book, which is, by the way, available now. If you wanted to go and pick it up, even though he wrote in the 12th century, you can still go pick it up today. It's called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And an amazing resource that some of you may not even be aware of. There's a theological library right up the road. It's called Lanier Theological Library. And it is an amazing resource. If you wanted to go check it out, I went by the other day. It's gated, and so you basically just let them know, hey, I heard about the library, I want to come check it out, and so they'll let you in. And Mark Lanier is the guy who owns it. He was one of the speakers yesterday. He's a lawyer, so he's filthy rich. I'm just making that up, but he has it basically in his backyard. And so if you just let him know, Mark or whoever, let us know about it. We want to come check it out. I'm sure they would open the doors to you. I want to go check it out myself. But I imagine that they have this book there, and among thousands of other titles. And so it's a really good resource if you want to go check that out. Lanier Theological Library. It's just literally right up the street. It's right over by the Willowbrook Medical Center. It's literally right there. It's right there. Yeah. Yeah, it's just hidden back. It's a little gym in the back. It's got all these reviews and everything. Check it out on Google. And so Ghazali formulates his argument very simply. His reasoning involves three very simple steps. And on your outline, it's not exemplified there. I've got a different version on the outline. But what he says can be simplified in three steps. It can say, number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. I'll go ahead and write his version up here. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. Has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist. The universe began to exist. Therefore, number three, and this follows logically, the universe has a cause. The universe has a cause. And so again, these first two premises are theologically neutral. What that means is that we don't have to look at the Bible in order to affirm either premise one or premise two. We can look, for instance, at premise two, we can look at scientific confirmation of premise 2. It's theologically neutral. It doesn't have religion doesn't play a part in defending premise 2. We don't need to bolster premise 2 by looking at the Bible at all. We can look at science, we can look at philosophy to defend 2. Same thing goes for premise 1. We don't need to look at the Bible in order to defend premise 1. But so this is his way of formulating it. We've got a different formulation on the handout. But so this is a logically valid argument, the argument that Al-Ghazali gives. And so the only question then is over whether the premises are more plausibly true than false. And so let's look at each one of the 2 premises. And so first premise 1 is whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. And again, this is Ghazali's formulation. But notice that Ghazali does not really need a premise which is so strong as premise 1, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. His argument, if you look at your outline, can be more modestly formulated as follows. And this is the version that I've included in the outline. Number 1, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. Okay, and that is a little bit more of a modest premise. It doesn't state that everything that begins to exist has a cause of its beginning, but simply that if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. And so this more modern, or this more modest version of Ghazali's argument will enable us to avoid certain objections. Sometimes atheists will say that at the quantum level, the subatomic level, these subatomic particles can come into being without a cause. And so they try to use this as an objection to this premise. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Okay, but if we formulate it in terms of premise 1, which is if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause, that says nothing about whether subatomic particles or anything like that exist or can exist without a cause. Hey guys, I'll give you some outlines here. There you go. There you go. So, for those of us that just joined, we're looking at the Kalam Cosmological argument, which is an argument for God from the beginning of the universe. Okay, and this is in contrast to the argument that we talked about for the last few weeks, which was basically from the fact that anything at all exists. There's anything, something exists, right? The universe exists, obviously. And so the question is, why does something exist rather than nothing? But this argument is different. This argument is saying, if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause. And you can see that premise 1 on your outline. Premise 2 is, the universe began to exist, which we're going to look at an extensive defense of that premise. Premise 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Okay, and then by conceptual analysis is just a big fancy word for saying we're going to examine what sort of cause could cause the universe. Okay, what sort of properties would that cause have to have? And that's what we're going to do at the end of class, or of this argument, is discover what sort of properties this cause would have to have.
Would you say the majority of atheists or non-believers believe that the universe began to exist?
There was an interesting discussion between William Lane Craig, who some of you saw yesterday, and Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence Krauss is a cosmologist. He's a very, very outspoken atheist against all religion. And he said in a sort of discussion with Craig in Australia, I think it was over a year ago now, he admitted that yes, probably the universe had a beginning. That's what he admitted as a cosmologist. And I think that we're going to look at some defenses of premise 2. But I would think that cosmologists would say, and there are going to be cosmologists that disagree, and I don't want to name them, but I think that if we look at these arguments and we don't have a good response to them, any good objections to these arguments in defense of the premise, then I think we are perfectly rational in holding that the universe began to exist. It may not, and again, we're not trying to offer up, we're not trying to have complete confidence or absolute certainty about these premises. If they are more plausibly true than their opposites, than their negations, then we're perfectly rational in holding them. Okay, we're not saying that this is proof in any sense of the term. We're not saying that we have mathematical proof of God's existence. We're saying that these arguments are supported, they have defended premises, and therefore they are rational for us to hold. Okay, and so it's an open question on whether or not these people would accept it or not. But that's really irrelevant to whether the premise is true, because someone could reject something that's true for bad reasons, even though that they might be an authority on the subject. They might have other biases and other things that are causing them to want to reject it. But so, or they might even think that an eternal universe, for instance, would be more beautiful or something like that. And so therefore they sort of look for every reason they can find to believe that the universe is eternal. Same thing might go for someone who wants to believe that the universe had a beginning. So that's why we have to look at the arguments. But so what we're doing is we're looking at premise one. And so Al-Ghazali was a 12th century medieval Islamic theologian who gave this argument back in the 12th century. He said, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Number 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. And so in our class, we're going to reformulate that first premise to say, to make it more modest. So it doesn't say that everything that begins to exist has a cause, but just that if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. And again, you can see that on your outline there. Good morning. And so, again, why is this premise, why would we prefer, I can see there's another one here. Why would we prefer this premise? And so again, sometimes atheists will object to this formulation of the premise and say that subatomic particles at the quantum level can pop into being without a cause. Okay, that's sometimes what they'll say, even though I think that's a misrepresentation of the science. This premise completely avoids that distraction. Okay, so we don't even have to go into that conversation at all. So we can just leave that issue completely aside as irrelevant to this premise that I have on our outline here. And so this alleged exception to Ghazali's premise is not relevant to our premise. And that is because the universe itself is all space-time reality, all physical reality. And therefore the universe, for the universe to come into being without a cause, it would have to come into being from nothing, which is certainly absurd. Okay, and we're going to discuss that right now. And so we can just sidestep this this issue that atheists sometimes raise about subatomic particles coming into being without a cause and all that. So we can just avoid that with this premise. And so let me give then 3 reasons in support of this premise 1. Number 1, something cannot come out of nothing. Number 1, something cannot come out of nothing. And so let's think about it for a second. To claim that something can come into being from nothing, not anything, is worse than magic. It's worse than magic, literally worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, at least you have the magician, right, that's pulling the rabbit out. Not to mention you have the hat as well. Okay, but to say that the universe could come into being without any sort of cause whatsoever would be to say that it comes into being from sheer non-being. It would be from nothing, and that is literally worse than magic. Okay, so you would have to believe that the entire universe just appeared at some point in the past for no reason whatsoever. But nobody, I think, sincerely believes that things like a horse or an Eskimo village can just pop into being without a cause. And so sometimes skeptics will respond to this point by saying that in physics, again, subatomic particles come into being from nothing. Or on certain theories of the origin of the universe, these are described in popular magazines as getting something from nothing. And again, we're going to go back to this discussion of Lawrence Krauss. But I think that this skeptical response represents a deliberate abuse of the science, sort of as I've already hinted to it. And so the theories in question have nothing or have to do with these particles. The universe originating as a fluctuation of a physical system. The universe sort of fluctuates into existence, but it's coming into being from another physical system. Okay, it's not coming into being from nothing. The vacuum, the quantum vacuum, for example, in modern physics is not what the layperson understands as a vacuum, namely nothing. So rather in physics, the vacuum is a sea of roiling energy governed by physical laws and having a physical structure. And so to tell lay people, like Krauss does in his books, that on such theories something comes from nothing, I think represents a deliberate misrepresentation of those theories. And so properly speaking, let's now talk about the word nothing, because we have to talk about it. What does nothing actually mean?
And just to let you guys know, there's a debate about that, and these big time guys spend an hour talking about what is nothing. It's pretty interesting. Like, what is nothing? And they'll go deep into it, and I'm sitting there listening to it like, what is this? So it's pretty interesting.
And so he's using...
I'm just going to hit on that now.
And so when Lawrence Krauss, he talks about nothing. He wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing, but he's not using the term nothing as philosophers use the term nothing, or as general people use the term nothing. So nothing is a term of universal negation. It means not anything. So, for example, if I say that I had nothing for breakfast today, I mean I didn't have anything for breakfast today. And if you read an account of World War II, and the text says that nothing stopped the German advance from sweeping across Belgium, that means that the German advance was not stopped by anything. Right? It was not stopped by anything. And this seems so basic, right? It's like, obviously, this is what nothing means. But if a theologian tells you that God created the universe out of nothing, he means that God's creation of the universe was not out of anything. It was not out of anything. So the word nothing, to repeat, is simply a term of universal negation, meaning not anything. And there's a whole series of words in the English language, terms of universal negation. Nobody means not anybody. None means not one. Nowhere means not anywhere. But so now, nothing is grammatically a pronoun, okay, in grammar. And so you can use it as the subject or direct object of a sentence. And so by using these terms of universal negation as words supposedly referring to something, you can generate all sorts of funny situations. For example, if you say, I saw nobody in the hall, the wisecrack says, yeah, he's been hanging around there a lot lately. Right? If you say, I had nothing for lunch today, he says, really, how did it taste? Right? And so it's misusing these terms of universal negation as though they were referring to something, when really you're not referring to anything. Right? You're saying not anything. I had nothing for lunch today. I did not have anything for lunch today. And so these kind of word tricks are as old as literature itself. For example, in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus introduces himself to Cyclops as no man or nobody. One night Odysseus puts out the Cyclops' eye. His fellow Cyclopses hear him screaming and then yell at him, "What's the matter with you, making so much noise that we can't sleep?" And the Cyclops answers, "Nobody is killing me. Nobody is killing me." And they reply, "Well, if nobody is attacking you, then you must be sick and there's nothing we can do about it." And in Euripides' version of the same story, he composes a sort of Abbott and Costello, who's on first routine. And here's how it goes in Euripides. It says, "Why are you crying out, Cyclops? Nobody has undone me. Then there is no one hurting you after all. Nobody is binding me. Then you're not blind. As blind as you. How could nobody have made you blind? You're mocking me, but where is this nobody? Nowhere, Cyclops." And so these use of negation, these terms of negation as substantive words referring to something is a joke. It's literally a joke in the English language. And so how astonishing it is to find someone like these popularizers of science, like Lawrence Krauss, whose mother tongue is English, using these terms precisely as if nothing were something. Okay, for example, Lawrence Krauss has recently published a book, like I said, called A Universe from Nothing, and in it are found the following quotes. He says, "There are a variety of forms of nothing, and they all have physical definitions. The laws of quantum mechanics tell us that nothing is unstable. 70% of the dominant stuff in the universe is nothing. There's nothing there, but it has energy. Nothing weighs something. Nothing is almost everything." In his book, he says these things. And so all of these claims take the word nothing to be a term referring to something. Right? For example, the quantum vacuum, or these quantum physical fields. That's what Lawrence Krauss is referring to. That's what he's saying nothing is this quantum vacuum. But these are physical realities, and therefore clearly not nothing. They are something. To call these realities nothing is at best misleading, or guaranteed to confuse lay people. people that aren't familiar with the science. And at worst it is, as I say, it's a deliberate misrepresentation of the science involved. And so to reiterate, point number one, in defense of premise one, is that something cannot come from nothing. It's literally worse than magic. Okay, with magic you have the magician, you also have the hat. But to say that the universe just came into being without a cause is literally worse than magic. You have no one pulling it out of a hat. You have no hat at all. The universe just comes into being for no reason at all. Okay, no one's there pulling it into being. You don't have an omnipotent being like God creating the universe. You have nothing. Okay, it just pops into being for no reason at all. And that is literally worse than magic. Okay, and so when you see a magician, you're obviously like, no, he's not pulling a rabbit out of a hat. He's not creating a rabbit ex nihilo. There's something going on. He stuffed the rabbit in there somehow. He's getting the rabbit out of it. But when the atheists say that the universe began to exist without a cause, they're saying that basically they're saying that magic is real. Something worse than magic is real. Okay. And then when atheists like Lawrence Krauss say you can get something from nothing, they're misrepresenting the science. Okay, it's not from nothing. It's from these quantum vacuums, these quantum physical fields. It's not nothing. Okay, and so these particles that they talk about don't come into being from literally nothing. They come into being from something. So defense number two of premise one: if something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable. You can't explain why just anything and everything doesn't come into being from nothing. And so think about it. Why don't bicycles and Beethoven and root beer come into being from nothing? Why is it only universes that come into being from nothing? Right? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? And so obviously I'm being facetious here, right? I'm using this term, nothing, to refer to something. But nothingness is not anything. It has no properties. Okay, it's just a term of universal negation. There isn't anything to be constrained. So nothing means not anything. So if things can come into being out of nothing without a cause, then all kinds of things ought to be doing this all the time. Okay, nothing is constraining these things from popping into being. And so the atheist might retort at this point, which is a very popular response, well, all right, so if everything has a cause, then what is God's cause? Okay, and they think that they've got this like brilliant response to this argument. And you'd probably be surprised how many atheists, even contemporary philosophers, maybe not philosophers, but scientists. Scientists like to speak on these questions because they are all-knowing. But so scientists will sometimes offer this objection. It literally happens. I've seen it. I forget the guy's name, but what it is, it's based on a complete misunderstanding of the premise. Okay, they say, well, if everything has a cause, then what is God's cause? But look at premise one again. It says whatever begins to exist has a cause. Okay, not everything. The premise is not everything has a cause. It's whatever begins to exist. And so what they've done is completely misunderstand the argument, even though they think they've got this brilliant objection. And so premise one, again, does not say that everything has a cause. It says everything that begins to exist has a cause. Or that if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause. And so Al-Ghazali, again, the guy who, the medieval Muslim theologian who formulated this argument, he would respond to this question by saying that God is eternal and uncaused. And so notice this isn't special pleading for God, because this is exactly what the atheist has traditionally thought about the universe itself. They say the universe is eternal and uncaused. But so the problem, I think, is that we have good evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had a beginning, evidence that we will look at in the coming weeks. Okay, and so that then backs the atheist into a corner, having to say that the universe sprang into being without a cause, which to my mind is completely absurd. Okay, literally worse than magic. I can't emphasize that enough. So number three, and this is the third defense of premise one. Common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise one. Premise one is always verified and never falsified. It's hard to understand how anyone committed to science could deny that premise one is more plausibly true than false in light of the evidence. We never see things popping into being uncaused out of nothing. We never witness it. Right? If we look at what these laws of nature tell us, is that the universe is stable. Okay, the universe operates according to these laws of nature. It's not that these things are just popping into being all the time and it's pure chaos, right? We don't see that at all. And so our actual experience of the world supports this premise as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and skip over this other objection that sometimes atheists will bring against this. So let's go ahead and just open it up for discussion. I want to give a couple minutes at the end to discuss a little bit of yesterday for those that went yesterday. So any discussion or questions on what we've covered in our defense of premise 1? Yes.
I have a question. I'm just trying to understand. If you have two seemingly intelligent people having a discussion over nothing, then nothing anyone ever says, no matter how good it may sound, is ever going to change their mind. They're never going to accept that there is a God.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the point?
Good question. I've got a lot of things to say about that. So yesterday we actually heard from Mary Jo Sharp, okay, and I'm going to reference her talk very quickly. She said that, again, we don't need to put this burden on ourselves, that we're the ones that are going to be convincing these people. Okay, it's really, that job is the Holy Spirit's job. Okay, it's not our job to convince these people. What we can do is we can open the door. We can speak to them and start to help them understand that Christians do have intellectual reasons for what they believe. Even if they want to disagree, even if they want to go to the ends of the earth with their skepticism, that's fine. But at least let them know, and we can help the Holy Spirit open the door for them. And so I think we can operate in that way, even though we may not be able to convince them. There's other things going on that are causing them not to want to be open to the evidence and that sort of thing. And so I had another point, and I just lost it. But just to go back to Mary Jo Sharp, I think that once we alleviate ourselves from that responsibility, then I think that we can see that all we need to do is sort of give some reasons. And I've just thought of my second point again. And so also what we can do with these arguments is not necessarily, we don't have to use them for evangelism. Okay, we don't have to convince people and spread the gospel necessarily with these arguments. What we can do, a second, I guess, thing that we can do with these arguments, sometimes they do convince people. Sometimes they do operate evangelistically. Sometimes people are convinced, they become Christians by the arguments. It's very rare. But what we can do instead is that we can help shape the culture. Okay, with these arguments, presenting these arguments, and letting people know that Christians are not idiots. Okay, and so that, I think, is worthy in and of itself. Even though we may not convince someone, we can start to shape the culture and help people understand that Christianity is intellectually viable. Okay, they don't have to throw their brains away if they want to become a Christian. Okay, and I think that if we shape the culture, that's going to have even more long-term effects in the future. And so instead of having to put this thing of like, I've got to convince this person, if we have these other things in mind about shaping culture and that sort of thing, I think that's going to help us and sort of get our goals right and not put these, super high standards on ourselves of I've got to convince all these people of this stuff. Like, no, we don't have to do that. Right? We just have to share. If we are asked what we believe, then we're ready. We're ready to share why we believe what we believe. And again, we've already sort of thought through these arguments, and if we don't think the argument is sound, we don't need it. We don't have to use it. Okay, and so it puts us in a unique position, because then we can defend the argument from what we actually believe, and not something that we're just wanting to believe. Right? We can say that I don't care about this argument. I don't need this argument for me to be rational in holding Christianity. And that was because we talked about the first argument back at the beginning of this series, is that belief in God, belief in the Christian truth can be warranted, completely rational, apart from arguments and evidence. So we don't need any of these, okay, to be rational. So I don't want to go over that. That's one of my favorite arguments, actually, one of my favorite subjects. But all of that to say that there's other things that we can do, I think, with sharing these arguments with atheists and non-believers. To piggyback.
What came to my mind, what you said, is make you fishermen of men. And when you think about a fisherman, you actually put the bait out there. And the fish is in the water, don't have to take that. But if the fish takes the bait, then you reel them in, and you got their attention. And so, like, when he gave a reason for what do you do when you get your attention, you let the Holy Spirit work on them. But you have to first get their attention. They have to see something in it.
And I think also that most people are not going to be convinced of something they hold very, very deeply in one conversation. They're not going to just completely change their belief system in one conversation. But what they might do is after that conversation start to reflect on the answers that they were giving and be like, those weren't really good answers. He had some interesting points. And so those seeds of doubt, I think, in their lives is going to be something that can also help. So even if it seems like at first they're just giving you all these reasons not to believe and whatnot, you might have planted a real deep seed of doubt and you just don't know. And so that's another thing to keep in mind, is that we can operate that way. Any other comments or questions on premise 1 of the argument? Because after this class, we're going to take a real deep study into premise 2 and figure out if there's good reason to believe that, which there's really interesting reasons.
That's a quick question.
Yeah.
You kind of touched on it just a little bit, but is there, or do you have a good way of explaining the infinite God when everything else is finite?
Okay, and so that's a good question. It pops up a lot. And so when we say that God is infinite, we don't mean that he is quantitatively infinite. We don't mean that he has all these physical parts and that he has an infinite number of parts, right? We mean to say that he's infinite in the sense that he's all-knowing. Okay, he's infinite in the sense that he's all-powerful. And so he's infinite in a qualitative sense, not in a quantitative sense. And so you might want to say it that way. Is that the universe, if it is infinite, then it is quantitatively infinite in the sense that it has an infinite number of events, prior events. Okay, and so that's actually a quantitative infinite. But God is not a quantitative. He's not, a mathematical formulation of objects. He's not that at all. He is qualitatively infinite. He's omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful. He's metaphysically necessary, but none of these is to say that he's like an infinite number of things. Okay, and so that's probably the way that you'd want to make that distinction, is to talk about the difference between a qualitative infinite and a quantitative infinite. So let's go ahead and open it up then for discussion about yesterday, for those that were able to make it out yesterday. Brittany bought some of the books of the first speaker, and so I wanted to hear from her first. I'm just going to go ahead and put her on the spot to open it up.
My girl Mary Jo Sharp. So it was really cool to hear from a woman apologist.
Real quick, for those that don't know, yesterday we went to, as a class, or some of us that could go on a Saturday, we went to Houston Apologetics Day. And they focused on the historicity, the historical grounding of the resurrection. That was the focus of yesterday. And so we heard from a number of different speakers. It was a conference. They provided lunch and all that kind of thing. And so one of the first speakers was Mary Jo Sharp. And so that's who she's talking about.
Yeah, Mary Jo, she's a professor at Houston Baptist. And she
teaches logic and a few other courses, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think something on Islam. Anyway, so it's great to hear from a woman, and she just really put me at ease, because what she was talking about was like what Cameron touched on. It's not our job to save people. That's the Holy Spirit's job. It's our job to plant the seeds. So in coming to this class, you feel like there's so much information, like what am I going to do if I'm really confronted with someone that just knows all their stuff? But the reality is that a lot of non-believers, a lot of atheists, they don't know all this stuff.
It's usually very surface level.
Very surface. And what Mary Jo was hitting on was these people, there's a root cause of why they believe what they believe. And if you talk to them, if you ask them questions specifically about what they believe, you eventually will come to know that root cause and be able to approach talking to them or planting the seeds that way. Because a lot of them, like I said earlier, they don't really know what they believe. They may have heard it on the Science Channel. Yeah. They may have, a dark history with their parents or whatever that made them the way that they are, or made them believe the way they believe. So what I took away from her was not necessarily feeling like you have to just machine gun somebody down with
arguments and
you need to do this, and the Bible says this, and 1 Corinthians says this. It's listening to them, questioning them on what they believe, and
why they believe it,
and forcing them to explain themselves, and
That's the
within
key
that
to it, is
explanation,
forcing them to explain how they feel,
right,
and then being able to defend how you're feeling and being able to explain that fully.
She gave 3 different types of questions, I think, that she said you ask in sequential order. So number 1 is, what do you mean by that? So if someone says something like, and the example she gave is, there's no empirical evidence for God. That was the first thing. And so she said the first question she asked him was, what do you mean by that? And he responded with, well, we can only know what the senses or physical senses tell us. That's what he meant by that. Okay, and she said, well, why, how do you know that? Was her next question. And then the third response that he gave was to cuss her out. And that was only 2 questions in, is what she said. And so you ask them, what do you mean by that? Just to make sure that you're clarifying, because we don't want to misrepresent what they are saying, what they believe. And that's actually unbiblical, is what she also pointed out. So we ask, what do you mean by that? Then you ask, how do you know that? What's the sort of evidence that you have for that? And then third, you ask them, why do you believe that? And so that series of questioning can probably go a long way. And as Christians, especially if you're familiar with these arguments, the first thing you want to do is start rattling them off like this. Like, oh, I got some evidence for you. I got some evidence. Because you just learn the stuff and you're like, yeah, just try to talk to me. Try to talk to me. Just try. But sometimes the best apologetic is just to ask questions. And that also just completely alleviates all the pressure off of you. And you can do that regardless of how far you are in these arguments. And then also you don't have to put this burden on yourself of having to know everything. She gave another example, and I just really liked her talk. She gave another example of how this woman at one of her talks, she was asked a question, and she said, I don't know the answer to that, but let's exchange emails and we can sort of investigate this question together. And she had this lady, I think, come up and talk to one of the organizers afterwards and say something like, in all my years of 30 years of being in the church, I've never seen any Christian do that.
It's okay to say, I don't know, let me get back to you on that. It just, in summary, it just made me feel relieved that I don't have to have all the answers. Listening to someone goes a long way. As long as we as Christians know our fundamental beliefs, I think that's, and I need to go back and make sure I understand what I believe about Christianity, and make sure it's not just because, Big Mama said this and we were brought to church because of this. And one of her books outlined some of those fundamental beliefs. So.
There's some really good questions that Christians need to really think about. She said one of the main deterrents from wanting to talk to anybody or even approach anybody is that you don't know what you believe. Or why you believe it.
So, just think about something that you're passionate about or something that you know a lot about. You know a lot about pharmacy. It'd be easy to spout off anything about pharmacy because you're comfortable with it. You know it. It's in you. It's easy for me to talk about blogging because I know it. It's in me. So the same passion that I have for those things, I need to have for Christianity and know exactly what I believe so I don't feel intimidated. And it's not like this a sweaty situation if somebody asks me what I believe. It
like what? Yeah, someone asks you.
Natural and organic.
Someone asks you, why do you believe Christianity? Yeah. Why do you believe Christianity is true?
And for a lot of people, you can't just say, I just have faith. You
just got to have faith.
Especially nowadays in our society, people want to know why. They want to know why, and they have every right to know why.
Especially with the internet, people can just go on the internet and see thousands of different bad arguments that they might think that, there's no answer to this argument, and so it's got to be a good argument. But if we have the answers, if we can start to provide answers to these fundamental questions that people are starting to have all over the place, and I think that's why we're starting to see the growth of secularism. More and more people are starting to grow towards just being spiritual, wanting to reject, any sort of formal religion, stuff like that. I think a figure that we saw is that there's only 2% of people that go to church in the UK regularly. 2.7% of people over there. And so if we don't want that to happen over here, I think we need to start to change the culture. They need to come in, yeah. So let me go ahead and just quickly close in prayer. So God, we thank you for another time we could come together and discuss these important issues. Thank you for everything that you did yesterday in the lives of everyone that was able to attend, and especially in my life. I thank you that you've shown me another passion of mine, and that I can go further and further and further into these arguments, and to also help shape the culture. I thank you for everything that you've done, everything that you are doing. In the name of Jesus, amen.